two, 1, 2, hey. Should be getting it. 2, 1, 2, hey. Yeah. Yes. 1, 2, hey. 1, 2, hey. Yes. Mic check. 1, 2, hey.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name
Check. 1, 3. Oh. Mm-hmm. This is a mic check. Yeah, clearly. Right, this is as we do a mic check. Time check is 5:28 on December 17th. Such an important day of the year, December 17th. Thank you. Yes, it's the day I was came into this world today. Thank you. So as we check the mic, it's singing different tones here. Yeah, we could sing it later. Yeah, check 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. So as we look at the TV screen, we hear coming back from the climate analytics. Yeah, check. You hear me? Mm-hmm. Check 1, 3, 5. The moderator today is a yeah. Check. Yeah, hear the difference there? Check 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. All right. The moderator today is a multimedia journalist. He's also a producer and anchor at Guardian Media as we do a mic check 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, 3. This is line 5, mic cordless number 7. Yeah, this one is a lot clearer. Yeah, this one kind of flat. A little brightness there on the high end. Yeah, check 1, 3. So kind of, I don't know if it's my voice. Next mic, see clearly. Check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, 3. So.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Kristen, and I am a climate diplomacy advisor with.
Evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for your patience. We'll begin in about 15 minutes. Thank you so much.
So good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here at Loft Gallery for the Caribbean Climate Analytics Caribbean COP29 debrief. It's a real pleasure to have so many of you turn out over a week before Christmas for climate change conversation on the back of COP29. My name is Ryan Bechu. I cover climate change for CNC3 Television and Guardian Media, where I'm the lead editor for news gathering there. Just some housekeeping rules just before we jump into everything. If we could just make sure our cell phones are all on silent so we don't disturb the conversation in any way. And please also just take a look at where your exits are so that in case anything happens, we know how we can get out of the building in the quickest way possible. The bathrooms are to the back as well in case you guys need to use it. So we're also into the festive season with just over a week to Christmas, and when this conversation wraps up in just about an hour and a half, we also invite you to please stay with us, mingle a little bit, make some friends, make some good connections that you can take into 2025 with you, so that we can all kind of keep growing the climate family, the climate change family in Trinidad and Tobago as well. So I attended COP29 as a journalist, and it was a surreal experience, really, in Baku. Not only was it incredibly cold, but it was incredibly cold for everybody. But also it was a truly eye-opening one for someone who has been to 2 COPs before that one. And Baku presented many challenges, not only in the environment in which it was the COP took place, but also the biggest topic of the COP, which was climate finance. And being there really was an eye-opening experience for me. Unlike Egypt, unlike Dubai, because climate finance was at the center of that conversation in Baku, and ultimately it was a disappointing end to that conversation, that negotiation in Azerbaijan. So I wanted to speak about it from 2 perspectives. One being from the personal perspective, and also then covering it as a journalist. From a personal perspective, that divide that we often talk about between global north and global south countries, having been to Dubai and having been to Sharm el Sheikh, the gap was just so visible in Baku. The divide was just so visible in Baku. The lack of care, the inconsideration from global north countries towards the plight of what is happening in SIDS, it was just so glaring in Baku. It was incredible. And I know that over the next hour we'll have Sasha and Ruana and we'll have Karlan and we'll have Ardeen talk about their own experiences, both from personal and professional standpoints. But from my personal perspective, coming from a small town in a small island, to watch what took place in Baku, and I know that Ruana talks about it all the time because she has such vast experience traveling to so many places and so many meetings on this particular topic. It was a little bit shocking still to notice the incredible divide and lack of care and consideration for what is happening. And something interesting happened while we were there. While we were there at COP29, just before that, a few weeks before, Madrid had some really bad flooding, devastating torrential flooding. And then here at home, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Grenada, and in Belize, there was also a lot of flooding happening, while world leaders were actually talking, well, negotiators were actually negotiating a way forward on how we can get finance to help the very people in Pinal, to help the very people in St. James, in Maraval, the very people who are experiencing it. And so as a journalist, it was really important for me to connect and cover what was happening here at home in the Caribbean with what was happening in Baku. And I think that's sometimes where, and I always kind of say this, I feel like sometimes this is where climate coverage gets a little bit tricky for not just Caribbean journalists, but also for international journalists. They get highly technical, they get wrapped up in the text. It's all about the words of the text and less about the human toll and human plight. And so that's where I sought to be a little bit different this year. I feel like we get too highly technical when it comes to climate change as journalists. Sometimes even, I'm sure Ruana might say, some negotiators as well get highly theoretical, highly technical, and we tend to dismiss or neglect or ignore what is actually happening on the ground and why we are actually there in these places, working towards what we're working towards. So as a journalist, it was also a successful experience to connect what was happening, the negotiations that were happening in Baku, with the reality of the human toll that was happening on the ground. But it also showed, in many instances, when you kind of walk around the venue and you talk to the different people. At one point, I remember getting a little bit, well, first of all, I was sick. I mean, a lot of other people were sick too. Bianca was sick as well. I think Ruana didn't feel well for a few days as well, and it was cold, so it didn't help. But I remember when walking around one day and speaking to someone, I believe he was from some part of London, and we just happened to have a conversation in the cafeteria area. And I kind of want to come back to where I started, because when we were talking and he just couldn't fathom what I was trying to explain to him, that there are real, authentic challenges happening in small islands. And I was trying not to talk for the Caribbean alone. I was kind of trying to make him understand about the Pacific as well, parts of Latin America. And I concluded, and I told Tyrell Gittins, I thought I might see Tyrell Gittins here, but I'm not seeing him. But I was telling Tyrell after that conversation that I don't think that people who live in big cities and who are from big cities could realistically really ever understand what we go through. Even after, I'm sure Ruana sits in meetings with these people all the time, hours upon hours, trying to make them understand the plight of small island developing states. But we who live it here, we really know it. And in some cases, what I concluded after COP29 in Baku was that, one, yes, they will never truly understand our challenges given that they don't live in small islands. But two, there seems to be a genuine unwillingness to step in our shoes, if only for a little bit, and see that. We step in their shoes because we travel to their big cities. We connect through their big cities, right? We read about their big cities, right? Because the New York Times and Reuters news agency and Washington Post, they don't really cover our small islands, but they cover the massive events that happened in these big cities. So we always connect with their cities and their countries, but that willingness to hear us and to understand us in a genuine, authentic way, I think that was a real eye-opener for me. Having attended a couple COPs before that, I did not see that level of division. And maybe for lack of a better word, discrimination. And so COP29 in Baku presented, real concerns for me personally and professionally, being in the climate change space and how we go into 2025. And I'm sure that we have a lot of differing opinions from those who attended COP in Baku. And I wanted to start with Ruana Haynes, who's a Climate Analytics Caribbean Director, to invite her on stage to give us a little bit of a breakdown of what she felt being an AOSIS negotiator and sitting in those halls, sitting in those negotiating rooms. Ruana, thank you very much for doing this and for having me as host and for being here this evening and for organizing this successful event. COP29, you had a unique lens to COP29, sitting in rooms that some of us weren't ever going to be in. How would you summarize it?
Thanks, Ryan, and good evening, everybody. First of all, let me say that I am no longer an AOSIS negotiator. I advise and support after having negotiated for many years. I think I agree with you on sort of the overall impression that this was quite a difficult COP. This is about my 14th COP, and I think it was one of the most difficult that I've ever participated in, and we've had some terrible ones over time. Part of the reason is because we were dealing with this extremely polarizing question of climate finance. Traditionally, climate finance has been an issue where you really see the divide between developed and developing countries. It has always been an extremely contentious discussion. And of course, the headline outcome for COP29 was this question of a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. But if we could just bring up the next slide. But that wasn't the only issue on the table. So at COP29, yes, finance was the highlight and the headline, but there are a number of issues that really needed some urgent resolution. And I haven't represented all of them here. There are some missing, loss and damage, for example, gender, for example, where they were negotiating a new action plan. And we have Marcia in the audience. Maybe she might want to give some comments on that. But this is the spread of the main issues that were under discussion. And I've attempted a bit of a stoplight analysis just to give an overall impression of what we came out with. You'll see that we don't have anything there fully green. There was no big go, there was no big win there. In the markets area, we have a minty shade, but it's still bordered in red. Why is that? Why is that? This was my attempt at nuance. One of our climate diplomacy experts, Kristen Quee, is going to speak a little later on about the details of what happened in markets. But just to say that it's a minty green because they have been in this discussion for the past 10 years, and it has finally concluded. And so I guess that is a good thing. But there are still a number of very loosey-goosey rules that have been agreed that could really end up undermining what we're setting out to do under the Paris Agreement in the first place. So, you know, with markets, it's always a double-edged sword. There's always a lot of excitement, but it really comes down to how it's implemented to see whether or not it creates a net value or the opposite. And so across the board, we have some, I guess, encouraging yellow markers on specifically finance and adaptation. Shay is going to get into the nitty-gritty on climate finance, but we know that the overall figure was a disappointment. We know that a lot of the rules that were put in place around how that climate finance gets administered were not up to the level that small island developing states needed. When we talk about finance, we don't just talk about a headline number. So we know we have the $300 billion number by 2035. We're also talking about the quality of finance, right? So that gets down to, can we actually access this money? And for small island developing states, it almost doesn't matter what the figure is if we cannot access it. And we're in a paradigm now where we have the $100 billion goal, and since it's been in place for almost 15 years now, small island developing states and least developed countries have traditionally had a very difficult time accessing this finance. And many times when we do access it, it hasn't been fit for purpose. So we would like to see, of course, more concessional financing and grants. A lot of the finance that is available is in the form of loans. So, you know, there are a lot of issues to unpick there. There was some advancements, which is why it's in yellow and not full on red or orange. Shay will give you all the overview. We were also supposed to be making progress in the areas of mitigation and just transition. And you'll see those in a lovely, bright red, along with loss and damage as well. Yes, I forgot I did add the loss and damage. So what happened? I guess on these, it's better to talk about what didn't happen. What didn't happen was any substantive follow-up on the energy package that was agreed in the global stocktake last year. So we were not able to make any progress to understand, well, how exactly globally are we meant to triple renewable energy or double energy efficiency or make any of this progress on phasing out fossil fuels generally, phasing out methane, etc. So absolutely none of that was substantively taken forward. And, you know, as a corollary to that, we have the just transition and this question of what exactly does this just transition work program that we agreed since 2022 in Sharm el-Sheikh look like? And we were also not able to make any progress there either. Carlin will get into this, but countries have very, very different ideas of what the priority focus should be when we talk about a just transition, on the understanding that we all need to be transitioning. But there are differences of views on where we're transitioning from or what we're transitioning to, what we're allowed to talk about at the global level or what needs to be discussed only at the national level. So a lot of disagreements there, hence very, you know, no progress whatsoever. In loss and damage, we had a strange situation. We were discussing the review of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which was established in 2013. It was the first institution that we set up to really address this loss and damage question, which is key for small island developing states. I think it was last week, there was a headline in the papers about the massive coral bleaching that is happening right as we speak in Tobago on the reef. This is an issue of loss and damage. This is as a result of the sea surface temperatures that have skyrocketed in the last few years as a result of climate change. So when we lose these ecosystems, which we haven't really fully costed, but when we lose these ecosystems that are so important for fish stocks, that are so important for the livelihoods of those who depend on it, and that are also providing protection to our coastlines, who pays for that? So this issue of loss and damage and the whim was a bit disappointing. We were supposed to be discussing how all of these institutions that we've now set up to address the loss and damage issue, how they can really work together. We were not able to come out of that discussion with a satisfactory outcome, and so that's now been pushed to next day, and Sasha will get into that a bit when she speaks next. And then we have the global stocktake. Again, a bittersweet tale. We were supposed to be doing a few different things under the global stocktake. So the global stocktake is meant to be this key moment that really helps us to understand how we are tracking and delivering on all of the goals under the Paris Agreement. And we had an outcome last year that we thought could help us on this mission to keep the average increase of temperatures to below or within 1.5 degrees Celsius. We were not able to follow up on key elements of that outcome. We were also supposed to be putting in place new rules and procedures for how the second global stocktake will run. It's already upon us. It starts in 2026 and will conclude in 2028. And all of that has now been pushed into next year. I deeply do not envy the incoming Brazilian presidency. They will be dealing with so much more than they should have been dealing with because we were unable to come out of this COP with the array of outcomes that we really needed, limping to the finish line. So with all of this, you might be asking yourself some questions. Are we really making progress? Do we actually stand a chance? Is the COP Paris Agreement process still fit for purpose? Is the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit still within reach? And, there's a huge narrative right now around, and Ryan, as a journalist, I'm sure you've heard it, around this question of the multilateralism on the whole. And, is it failing? Has it failed? It's retracting. I mean, I have to say that this is not the first time we've heard this narrative. We've heard it before. Every few years, there's a major, very scandalous failure within a multilateral process, and everybody gets excited. Is multilateralism failing? Do we get rid of the UN? Do we burn it all down? Well, the answer is no. But of course, we must acknowledge that where we are right now is in a very difficult place at a very difficult time. So we are meant to be making concrete, transformational progress in addressing climate change, and also in the context of progressing towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which are supposed to be delivered in 2030. And we're not. We're simply not. Every conversation is really difficult. Every conversation that's happening around these key issues of the literal viability of the human species on Earth, and I'm not overstating it, every one of those conversations is flagging. But have they failed? No, they have not failed. And I don't think that that is a narrative that serves us here where we sit as the small, vulnerable, and economically disadvantaged on the global stage. It's easy to push us aside. There have been lots of conversations over the years around, well, maybe what we need is a smaller forum. Maybe we need less parties around the table. Maybe that will get us to agreements and outcomes. And we all know in those small forums who is going to be left out. And so just a reminder, and we can come back to this later on in the discussion, the multilateral process is the same process that has gotten us to the point where, for the first time, the premier international court in the world is addressing the climate change issue. Now, people are saying, well, the COP process has failed, let's just pivot to the ICJ. That also does not work. And if we're going to be talking about the International Court of Justice as a space where maybe we can have progress, maybe we can have solutions, we need to recall that questions only get into that court if states agree. An advisory opinion is requested by the member states of the United Nations. And so it's the same multilateralism that has gotten us to this point where the court is considering this issue. So we can talk about this later on, but I just wanted to set the context for the rest of the discussion and hopefully address some of the burden issues that people have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rana. That was excellent. And you're so right in the sense that this, whether the COP process works, whether multilateralism even makes sense anymore, it kind of has its peaks and troughs because it can't be a coincidence that these questions and articles and comments are coming up when we've just had a change in the US presidency. So, and several parts of Europe are also going right wing. So you're very right. These questions come up and then they die down again and then they come again. It was a finance COP. This COP was meant to better the $100 billion pledge that was made 15 years ago in Copenhagen in 2009. Didn't get anywhere close to what small island developing states were hoping for, and that would have been a floor of $1.3 trillion. In fact, it was just tripled from the $100 billion to $300 billion annually. I think it's on until 2035. You could correct me if I'm wrong, yeah? And to give us a little bit more into the financial aspect of what happened at COP29, I want to welcome Climate Analytics Caribbean Project Manager, Shayleaf Lewing. Shayleaf, that was, you're going to deal with the financial aspect of COP29. Did you actually even get over what happened at COP?
So good evening, everyone. First of all, that's a good question. Bianca and I have had conversations after the fact just about mentally how it would have, it still plays on our minds how everything unfolded. So, and as you would have mentioned, you were at 3 COPs. This would have been my 3rd COP as well. And I mean, definitely the most difficult out of the 3. Yes, it was cold. The same way everybody in Trinidad was apparently sick at that time. Everyone in Baku was very ill also. And this is my 3rd COP following climate finance as well. So following it for the past 3 years and seeing how unwilling the parties are to discuss even the definition of climate finance kind of sets the tone for how the conversation is going to go. The NCQG in particular, which was basically the cornerstone of this COP, it is the culmination of 3 years of technical expert dialogues, workshops at the last 2 COPs, the last 2 SBs, and we discussed all of these issues over and over, and then we got to this COP and left with what we left with. And you hit the nail on the head in there seems to be an unwillingness to really pay attention and engage in any substantive conversations or negotiations, and I guess that's what would have led to the walkout on the final day. So that being said, I just want to get into the slide. Okay, good, so they're up. So first of all, the NCQG, the New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance, why is it important to SIDS? It's no secret that we are affected the most while we contribute the least to climate change and to the issue. We feel the disproportionate effects of climate change, and they affect large percentages of our population, and they affect us greatly financially as well. And this is just due to our small size, our small economies, and our vulnerability. We live in these realities every day. We experience the flash flooding, the irregular and unpredictable seasons, harsher hurricane seasons and eroding coastlines, and we just do not have the fiscal space and the finances and the resources to address the adaptation, the mitigation, and the loss and damage efforts needed. So I'll get into the AOSIS and the SIDS asks at this particular COP. So there was a coordinated approach with LDCs, the least developed countries, which would have seen us land on a collective figure of at least 1.3 trillion, and that was based on an assessment of the needs of developing countries. It wasn't just chosen because it sounded good. Coordination with the LDCs also led both groups to requesting minimum allocation floors. Now, this was essential to address previous barriers to accessing financing. Our minimum allocation floor as SIDS was around the vicinity of 39 billion per year. This we know we didn't get as well. And as Ru would have mentioned, as important as the quantum is, the qualitative aspects of the fund are equally as important. So we can get, even if we did ask for the 1.3 trillion and we got it, if we did not have access to it, which we don't to most of the funds, then it means absolutely nothing to us in the long run. And looking back at the Paris Agreement, there's reference to SIDS and LDC's special recognition. So the agreement requires developed countries to provide mandatory funding to developing countries. It offers special flexibility for SIDS and LDCs in terms of transparency and compliance, and it emphasizes climate-related capacity building for developing countries and requests that developed countries increase support for these efforts. So going into the outcomes, which would be on the screen for you to digest as well, we would have landed on an unquantifiable, quote-unquote, significant increase in public resources. But the important language to note in this paragraph of the text would be outflows. So there's supposed to be a significant increase of outflows to SIDS and LDCs from the funds that we already have minimum allocations to. This would include the financial mechanism, the Adaptation Fund, the LDC Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund. But it doesn't address money going into the fund. There's invitations to the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks. Basically, if you feel like it, and if it's within your current mandates, then feel free to help us out by scaling up concessional financing. So the language might sound nice, but this is essentially what it means in layman's terms. The biennial report commenced in 2028. Most importantly, I guess, from our request of at least 1.3 trillion, we would have gotten just shy of a quarter of that mark with 300 billion. 300 billion by 2035 from a variety of sources, including MDB contributions from all parties. All parties means us as well. So, cool, yeah, 300 billion, but you all could throw something in as well to help yourself. We would have also kicked the proverbial can down the road to Belém by way of the Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion per year by 2035, with a report in 2025. This outcome is really just an outlook to COP30 in essence. Now, regarding the qualitative aspects and the special circumstances, it was mentioned capacity constraints, fiscal constraints, and increasing adaptation costs, especially for SIDS and LDCs, got a special mention in the text. But lastly, there's the mandate for a report from the Standing Committee on Finance to include information disaggregated by regions for SIDS and LDC, something that we would have been asking for in the technical expert dialogues, in the workshops for the last 3 years. They just said, all right, cool. You all action this now when you get a chance, basically. So we say all that to say, looking forward to 2025 and COP30 in Belém. We got some Article 2.1c workshops. That is a finance topic that was barely touched at this COP. The reports that will come later down the line. But most importantly, the roadmap to the 1.3 trillion. We don't know what this would look like yet. It is still a conversation to be had. But the roadmap goals, as far as we understand it, are meant to include identifying ways to mobilize more funds for climate action, scaling up climate finance to support low carbon development, helping countries cut emissions and adapt to climate change, and considering a range of sources to bridge the financing gap, as well as establishing clear milestones. So we basically said, let's meet down the road and, and figure this one out.
As Ruana said, whoever is the COP30 president, good luck.
Yeah, definitely. They have their work cut out for them. This being a finance COP, it ended and it was gavelled in a way that basically said, please just take this and deal with this in Brazil.
To be continued. Yeah, thank you very much, Shalif. Appreciate it. Want to change our focus now to the outcome on adaptation. So now out of Baku, we have the Baku roadmap on adaptation. We also have the Baku high-level dialogue on adaptation. Some matters were also agreed upon when it comes to the global goal on adaptation. And to talk us through the outcome of adaptation at COP29 in Baku, I want to welcome to the stage Sasha Jatan Singh, who is the Climate Analytics Caribbean's loss and damage expert. Sasha. So, Sasha, looking at these agreements that were made at COP29 in Baku, can you give us some background on how we arrived at these agreements, one, but also what it means for us here in this region?
Sure. So, good evening, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. And, for adaptation, I'm bringing some Christmas cheer. Because I think for adaptation, we had the most cautiously positive outcomes at COP. And, just the context adaptation has really long been sidelined in the history of the UNFCCC negotiations. The focus has been on mitigation and most recently loss and damage. But now adaptation is coming into its own. And next year at COP30, it's shaping up to be very important for adaptation, where the indicators for the global goal on adaptation will be agreed there. And then also we have the doubling of adaptation finance by 2025, right? So there are a lot of big ticket items happening for adaptation. And I did a stoplight analysis. That's supposed to be yellow. No, it is green, sorry. So it's very detailed, but I wanted to just explain what happened, because these negotiations don't happen in a silo and in a vacuum. And, for the global goal on adaptation, in 2015, in the Paris Agreement, Article 7 actually speaks to this global goal on adaptation that was established. And that's for countries to enhance their adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability to climate change. But very little action or progress was made on the GG for years, up until COP26 in Glasgow, where a work program, the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, was established. And out of that, the outcome of that at COP28 in Dubai was that we established the UAE Global Climate Resilience Framework. So it's a framework for the GG that includes specific GG targets. So that could be thematic targets like food, infrastructure, health, biodiversity, also, water as well. And and in addition to that, we had a work program, the UAE BELEM work program on the development of indicators that came out of it. So these indicators would really measure the progress. How are we doing on achieving the GGA, the Global Goal on Adaptation? And at COP29, we saw some progress on streamlining indicators, because initially, you know, the indicators numbered over 7,000 indicators. So there was a mapping exercise that was done, you know, throughout the year. And it was 7,000. We got an agreement that, you know, the final number should be less than 100 indicators. That should be globally applicable with a menu of nationally applicable options. And having a reduced or streamlined number is very important for SIDS and LDCs, because we already have issues with you know, capacity constraints. We want to reduce data burdens and reporting burdens, right? And it has to be relevant to measuring progress globally, because the goal is a global goal on adaptation. And we already, you know, when we do our reporting under our adaptation communications, our national communications, even under our national adaptation plans, countries report nationally on what progress we are making, right? So also what happened at COP28 is that we also provided guidance to technical experts that for them to continue their work on how these issues should be settled in terms of these streamlined indicators. What should that entail? They have guidance on the criteria for how these indicators should look like. What is important to know that a really big disagreement, a really contentious point, was means of implementation. So that's basically resources and money, right? And you know, developed countries wanted means of implementation to stay in the climate finance track, whereas developing countries were really pushing for the need for indicators that measure means of implementation, because we need to measure support and resources for adaptation in addition to measuring, you know, the progress on adaptation action, right? Because you cannot, you need to know what sort of resources, money, technology, capacity is needed to ramp up adaptation action, right? And what we got ultimately is that we got means of implementation included, albeit under enabling factors, which is something developed countries love, and it includes things like transparency and governance, but we have means of implementation there in the final outcome of the set of GGA indicators that will be agreed at COP30. So I think that's a really big win. And for us moving forward, you know, we have to also, this is where, you know, Caribbean countries, SIDS and so on, could really help support experts. You know, there will be submissions throughout the year coming out. So people, you know, civil society networks like the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance and others could support in providing inputs to guide the experts, to guide parties when we do our negotiations at COP, because COP30 is happening in Belém, which is a stone's throw away. It's not Baku. It'll be a lot easier to get to, and we should have a say on adaptation and inform on what we want these GGA indicators to look like. And some I would say positive outcomes, as well, as Ryan mentioned, was we also agreed at COP29 to launch the Baku Adaptation Roadmap, which, you know, will aim to help focus the discussion on how to support the full implementation of the GGA and enhance adaptation action. And also, what's quite important is that negotiators also agreed that the GGA will be a standing agenda item that will continue post COP30. And this is quite important because, you know, we now have an agenda item for the GGA to be discussed at subsequent COPs. So usually the adaptation discussions is quite dispersed, you know, and it doesn't really have an institutionalized home, but this is a very strong signal that adaptation and the GG will now have permanence in the negotiations. Also, I think what is quite interesting is that at COP29, we also agreed on the Baku high-level dialogue on adaptation. And this will be convened on the margins of subsequent COP sessions, starting from COP30. And the aim of this high-level dialogue is to identify ways of enhancing the implementation of the UAE Global Climate Resilience Framework. And this is important because this high-level dialogue could possibly elevate adaptation as a political priority for governments in the future, and it could serve to ramp up much-needed adaptation ambition, both in terms of action and both in terms of support. Of course, this remains to be seen, but there's, positive signals coming out from COP29 in terms of adaptation. So it remains to be seen how that's going to play out over the coming year into COP30. And so why adaptation is yellow is because, of course, national adaptation plans, which is quite important, NAPS, has been, for the last few COPs, we've been having, procedural decisions coming out of that. And right now, the draft decision will be moved to SB 60 in June 2025. And this is actually quite disheartening because NAPs are important because it allows countries to set out how they're going about, to adapt to climate change. And they outline, these are the actions, these are the estimates, these are the investment requirements for undertaking adaptation. And it's important to know that countries, developing countries and developed countries have actually submitted NAPs to the UNFCCC in 2024, including Trinidad and Tobago. So definitely give that a read, it's quite important. And we will see how NAPs could be progressed. But just note that, with the focus on finance, the other rooms tend to be held hostage by the big ticket items, finance and mitigation. So that could have been why. So we're hoping for progress. And regardless, what we're seeing is that countries are developing and submitting their NAPs because they see this as a priority. And this will also be important when we have to develop our nationally, or update our nationally determined contributions in 2025 as well. So I think we could move on to loss and damage. So I only focus on the loss and damage fund, and I put it as yellow, right? And I think what's important for the loss and damage fund is that, right now the fund is fully operationalized in at COP29. So we have, hosting agreement, host country agreement, trustee agreement, and a secretariat hosting agreement formally, established. So, the fund officially has a name. It's the Fund to Respond to Loss and Damage. It has a home. It's in Manila, in the Philippines, and it now has an executive director. He's from Senegal. I cannot remember his name. My apologies. But one of the issues with this fund is that as of COP29, there was no resource mobilization strategy. So even though we have the fund, we don't know what are the procedures and the access modalities and so on for countries to access it, right? But when was it? The 2nd to the 5th of December, the board of the Loss and Damage Fund met, and they actually established a roadmap to start up the fund with a view to be able to support developing countries towards the end of 2025. So the hope is that developing countries will be able to start accessing the fund. And we also should note that even though the fund was initially capitalized last year with less than 700 million at COP28. In COP29, we only had 3 pledges that moved this number up to about 730 million. So you could see, you know, it's still quite minimal. And I know under the NCQG, one of the key asks from SIDS and LDCs was the need for a loss and damage sub-goal. And that would have really helped to ensure that loss and damage finance would be prioritized, including, you know, the efficient and sufficient capitalization of the loss and damage fund, which is critical for developing countries. But regardless, you know, we have this resource mobilization fund. And also, I think it's quite important to note that in April next year, the 5th board meeting of the Loss and Damage Fund is going to happen in Barbados. So right in our backyard, basically. And the Loss and Damage Collaboration is actually compiling case studies to finance, you know, on community access to finance, right? And trying to get, you know, just case studies to share at the fund. So that's another opportunity where Caribbean civil society and so on could actually share case studies, best practices, and so on. So you see there are opportunities here. We just have to grab it and collaborate together. So I'll leave you with that, a little bit of Christmas cheer.
Until it was doom and gloom. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Sasha. Appreciate it. Sasha Jatan Singh. Rana says she doesn't appreciate that. But there was also some good news on the front. We now have some greater insight as well when it comes to just transition, right? And our negotiators out there in Baku really pressed home the need to advance our agenda, our Caribbean agenda, our small island developing states agenda when it comes to just transition. Trinidad and Tobago is in a really critical position when it comes to just transition, being an oil and gas based economy, right? To offer some insight into the just transition progress that was made at COP29 in Baku, I want to welcome the Climate Analytics Caribbean Climate Policy Advisor in Colin Mendoza. Colin.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Well, I thought I was going to get the seat, the uncomfortable seat, because Just Transition really didn't have any sort of progress, so I thought they were punishing me for that. But again, thanks for being here, and I'm happy to be here just to not talk about progress, but talk about what we can do and the next steps we can take to actually progress this outcome in just transition. And as Ryan indicated, a topic that is very much near and real to us in Trinidad and Tobago. So COP29, get forward to the next slide, please. So in COP29, the Just Transition Work Program negotiations resulted in a Rule 16. What we call a Rule 16 in this process is there was no agreement by parties, and the discussions were pushed to next year, COP30, and the discussions will begin at the subsidiary bodies meeting at the June climate meeting, so it will continue. However, we had some progress in terms of the quality of discussions that occurred in the room. We just couldn't get it over the line. Because there is a common saying within the Just Transition room that the transition is for everyone and for all countries. And you would hear developed countries, when they begin their interventions, talk about this is an important topic for them, it's an important topic for everyone around the table. And that is quite true and correct. However, as Ruana pointed out, the divergence with where we see each other fitting within the topic is what didn't carry us across the line. So, for developed countries, they believe that just transitions are nationally determined, and it is something that you, as your individual sovereign state, will put plans into motion and effect a just transition. That's absolutely correct. However, developing countries see just transition as a matter of climate justice. We see it as a matter of the means of implementation, as Sasha referred to, in terms of resources, in terms of capacity building, in terms of reskilling workers, retooling workers, doing all the necessary elements that we may not be able to afford to do on our own. So it's all well and good to have high-level just transition principles, actions, roadmaps, and plans, but how is it possible to be effected and really make an impact for our societies? And also there is the discussion about cross-border measures that are taken by states that can affect the just transition. Say, for example, there have been talks about carbon border adjustment measures in terms of a tax that's to be charged to certain, that is levied on certain goods coming from certain countries, etc. That forms part of the transition and the discussions happening there. So in terms of those discussions and where those discussions fall and if there's a home for these discussions, that is why we couldn't get across the line, because of the divergent views held in the room amongst parties. So a positive note in the second box is that the discussions reinforce the inclusion of vulnerable groups, workers, indigenous communities, etc. And this was very much important because there was a lot of talk about human rights, and we saw that there was the acceptance that the transition or just transition is also a human rights issue. So a lot of the NGOs and parties were very much engaged and committed on forwarding ideas around the transition and making sure that the impact of the transition really doesn't affect the most vulnerable. And there was also common ground in terms of the discussions around adaptation. So just transition, you would think it's just a matter of mitigation, moving from high carbon to low carbon economy, but it's a matter of adaptation. It's a matter of building resilience for our countries and our communities in the wake of extreme hurricanes that we face in the Caribbean. So it's a matter of how we transition in totality. And in terms of the next steps, this conversation on just transition, as I said, was pushed to the SP meetings in June, which would be, hopefully we can come out with a decision at COP30. And we have a deadline of February 15th, because the Just Transition Work Program is also entails 2 annual workshops, which are discussions around the set topics, what is important for countries, and we have the opportunity to make submissions as to what we want to discuss so that it can really come and bring a fruitful outcome of this work program. So in adaptation, or even in this process, there's always this sort of work program that leads to an outcome of a framework, a mechanism, etc. So there were talks around the room of a framework. It may have been a bit premature. However, it is something that in 2025, because the Just Transition Work Program ends in 2026, it is something that we will want to pay particular attention to, because we don't want a situation where you've had 3 years of talk shops and no sort of outcome and no sort of real input. So I'd leave it at that, because I don't want to take no more time from the wine. All right?
I like a considerate panelist. I love a considerate panelist. Thank you very much, Colin. I appreciate it. I want to move on to another dynamic topic as well, and this one is a really, really important topic, especially as we head to a country like Brazil for COP30, right? Carbon markets, a really important one. And to speak on that, we have Ms. Kristen Q, who's a climate diplomacy advisor at Climate Analytics Caribbean, and somebody who is really an extraordinary example of how young people can not only enter the climate space, but also have an extraordinary impact in the climate space, because she's been doing incredible work, especially as it pertains to carbon market. I mean, her CV is incredible. She's worked with the Environmental Defense Fund in Washington, D.C. She's closely followed Article 6 negotiations under the Paris Agreement. She's, She's been an expert in the development of the International Civil Aviation Organization's Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. Prior to that, she worked with the Global Island Partnership and UNDP in Barbados and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States on Climate Change and Sustainable Development on SIDS. I mean, her CV is just incredible. And we have a 5-minute presentation from Kristen on carbon markets. If we could play that now, Bianca.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Kristen, and I am a climate diplomacy advisor with Climate Analytics. And I have the opportunity to present to you on the COP29 outcomes on carbon markets. But before we do that, I just want to provide a brief explanation of what carbon markets are to make sure that we are all on the same page. So essentially, carbon markets allow us to buy and sell carbon dioxide emissions reductions and or removals. And why would anybody want to do this? So there are a number of different reasons that are often given for wanting to participate in carbon markets, but I'll just provide 2 examples. One example or commonly cited reason given is the cost effectiveness of participating in carbon markets. So in some instances, it's actually cheaper to purchase carbon dioxide emissions reductions from another jurisdiction rather than doing the agreement in your jurisdiction. Another reason is if you're dealing with a hard-to-abate sector, like the aviation sector, we do not currently have a drop-in fuel that can replace jet fuel and take your plane from point A to point B safely. And so for airlines that want to reduce their emissions reductions, reduce their emissions, or that want to count emissions reductions towards their climate target, they may wish to participate in carbon markets and purchase those emissions reductions from elsewhere. So now that we have that brief overview of what carbon markets are and why anyone would want to participate in one, I will provide the brief update on what happened at COP29. So at COP29, we essentially agreed to further rules and guidance on operationalizing the carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. So countries now have further information on how they can go about participating in carbon markets to reach their Paris Agreement goals, if that's something that they wish to do. The rules and guidance provide information on the type of infrastructure that countries need to participate in carbon markets. And in some instances, countries may need to set up additional policies to be able to do this, based on the rules and guidance that we adopted at COP29 and those that we've adopted before. We also agreed to a sustainable development tool, which essentially will help to ensure that carbon markets actually contribute to sustainable development goals, as well as avoid harm to the environment and the planet. And overall, the rules and guidance that we agreed at COP29 set the international standard for carbon markets in a manner that tries to promote environmental integrity and robustness to avoid double counting. So with that, that's just a very brief overview of what we agreed at COP29. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll pass it back to the host.
All right, thank you very much, very much, Kristen, for that quick overview on carbon markets. And as Kristen was alluding to, it becomes even more important as we head into the next COP. Another very critical, important, that we tend to often overlook, and I know this is something that Ruana has been an advocate for and very passionate about, is the role of civil society when it comes to action on climate change. And at COP29 in Baku, the Cropper Foundation was represented by its lead communication specialist in Ardeen Sergio. Ardeen, good evening to you. Please come on. So you probably know Ardeen in so many different roles as a podcast presenter, voice on I-95.5 FM. So versatile in everything that she does, not only now within the climate sphere, but she's been into the arts, into culture. Ardeen, it's so great to have you. It was great to have you in Baku in COP29 as well. Congratulations on the incredible work that Cropper did there, launching a book across there.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was incredible. Tell us a little bit about what you noticed for civil society at that global level and the role of civil society going into 2025 when it comes to climate change.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you to Climate Analytics, the entire team, for including me and the Cropper Foundation in this event. Now I'll be the one standing between you and wine. So I will try to make this as interesting as possible because what I have to share is certainly not in the league of what you've heard as far as the technical COP recap is concerned. But first of all, the Cropper Foundation, for those of you who don't know, we are an award-winning 24-year-old sustainability-focused organization with an expanding work program around civic engagement and civil society strengthening, which I suppose explains why we went to COP. So we went to COP to launch the preview of a climate justice anthology, a Caribbean climate justice anthology that comes under one of our projects, Today Congote. Does anyone here know or is familiar with One Day Congote? Can I see by a raise of hands how many of you are familiar with it? Right. And that's generally people over 35, let's say. I'm not meaning to age anybody, right? I'm just saying, from what I could see in the audience. Okay, let's say 30. I'll be generous. So basically, it's a saying. I've realized that it's more widely known in Trinidad and Grenada. I don't really hear or see any traction from the other islands, but it speaks to the idea that you will see. Those who can't hear will feel. Your time will come. So one day, Congote Mulhodge has a book titled that. And so we decided to adapt that message to reflect the urgency of climate change. Yeah? So we said, well, it's no more one day, it is here. So we went with Today Congote, and again, it is about registering the urgency of our situation. And several of our speakers so far have talked about climate justice, even if they didn't call it that. When Ryan, in your opening salvo, that's really what you were describing, right? How are the most vulnerable affected by climate change? How are they represented? How are their interests represented? And that's what the anthology aims to do. That's what the project aims to do through the arts. So this is the second component in that project. Now, so we went to COP. We had this very ambitious idea when we conceptualized this project that we would launch it in a place and on a platform that could get the attention of the technical people, the people in the important rooms, and also other Caribbean people. And so we decided to do that at the CARICOM Pavilion. And one of the things I would say as civil society is that it's really important to be pushy, right? I think that's how we get a lot done. And I'm seeing a lot of my colleagues in the room. Nicole, you know, Marcia, I mean, so many people, Khadija, you know, we know what it is to be pushy. When we want something, no is never the answer you settle for. You just accept and move on. You always find a workaround. And to be honest, getting to COP was no different. Thankfully, through the work of the foundation, we have some very strong allies in Kishan Kumar Singh, for instance, at the Ministry of Planning, and in other places in CARICOM at 5Cs. And so we were able to make our way there. And one of the things that I noted at the pavilion, and I've had this conversation with Ruana and others, is that our CARICOM pavilion, which has a very specific mandate from the CARICOM Secretariat, because the 5Cs, the CARICOM Climate Change Center, they manage that pavilion, and their mandate is to serve the governments of the region. So the technical people, the negotiators, state representatives, that's who they're there to serve. And when you show up at the pavilion, you do get that sense. You do not feel like this is a space, well, I was surprised by that, I have to admit, I was taken aback, that it was not a space that seemed welcoming to civil society, and it's not intentionally so, it's just a byproduct of that mandate. And what was useful, I think, was to demonstrate that there is so much value in introducing a different type of content at the CARICOM Pavilion. Many people were surprised, some were confused, admittedly, as to why we were doing this event there. They said, you know, this is the event you find at Moana Blue Pacific Pavilion. It's not a CARICOM Pavilion kind of event. But then there were so many who were open and loved the fact that here is something that celebrates us. You heard our voices, you know, celebrating our stories, or even because some of our stories are not celebratory, especially when we talk about climate impacts and the justice issue that attend. And I think they felt, yeah, we want to see more of this. Even the executive director of 5Cs agreed that we could be doing more creative work, and there is a possibility for us to collaborate, to curate what a program looks like in the future, hopefully starting in Brazil next year, what it could look like to reflect something that incorporates more of that creative expression and that tells our stories in different and more engaging ways. And there was admission, and we have it on tape, that maybe the ways that they have been engaging so far have not been the most effective, and they're very open to embracing new ideas. And so that was a big win, I think, for us. One of the other things I would say, and this comes back to being pushy, and I will add focused, is it's important to make use of the people to whom you have access there. And one of the things I did not know is how many people, Caribbean people, are operating and running this show at all levels of the UNFCCC. At every level, there is a Trinidadian, Jamaican, Bajan, and I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to interact with a number of them who've been a part of the process, like Rwanda, for a very, very long time. And they're now, for me, institutional knowledge. And we have to make use of that. And I think, and this is where, again, being pushy and focused comes into play, because if we don't make it our business to go to them and ask the questions, we won't have access to that information and very unique perspectives, and also the things people tell you off the record. They're very useful, and we know this as journalists, yes? So I think making the point of making those connections, regardless of what sector you're operating in, is very important, and being strategic about how we use that going forward. Sasha, you emphasized the need for civil society to step up, particularly outside of COP, in how we engage the process, and I think that became very clear to me. And the other thing, and that leads me to the third value that we need to, I think, inculcate to civil society, and that is this word accountability. It's really important. And it's not just important when we think about the rabble-rousing, and that has its place. But when we come back home from COP and we attend sessions like this and we get the information and we understand that there are policies that our governments have come up with and they have submitted to international bodies, then we have a responsibility to hold them accountable to that. And I don't think I can overstate how much more of that we need to do, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but in the region. And that became glaring to me. And one of the very productive conversations I had with Kishan was about how do we work together, and we are now having the conversation about working together to strategize around the equipping of young people specifically to engage with those policies, and how we not just show them the ins and outs, but how do you prepare them? Because this is an exercise in diplomacy at the end of the day, and I think that's another thing that we take for granted. I had the opportunity to witness the Just Transition Contact Group, and that was mind-shifting for me in terms of my understanding of what happens in rooms like this and how things can break down, and the vital role that diplomacy plays. And I think training our young people to be able to understand these processes, what it takes, the skill that it takes also. Being open, I think it's so crucial to advancing the conversation. Okay, so we may not agree on this, but how do we keep the lines of communication open? And so that is one of the exciting prospects I'm looking forward to coming out of the experience at COP, and how we can further and deepen our engagement with the relevant authorities. There's so much more to be said, but I feel that captures it, because I do want to take some time to just talk a little bit about the anthology and to let you all know that, and we have a video of one of the pieces, an excerpt of one of the pieces to show, and to let you all know that the sample, the ebook, is available on our website for download. It's free. And yes, please, round of applause, yeah. And as I said, it is a preview to the full anthology, which will be published next year, and it will be launched at the NGC Bucas Lit Fest. So we look forward to that. We've had two powerhouses editing the anthology, in Diana Macaulay, who's Jamaican, and Shivani Ramlochan, who's here from Trinidad and Tobago. And it will be published by Pcash. And I'm just really grateful to Open Society Foundations also for believing in this work in the region and supporting so much of the climate justice work in the Caribbean. So I'd like to just introduce this piece from one of our featured authors in the sample, Anika Christopher. She's from the British Virgin Islands. She's one of 6 authors whose works are featured in the anthology. And this is an excerpt from one of her poems, Tanti Tells a Story.
Tanti tells a story. When Tanti Tree starts rocking in her wooden chair, Bible balance on her knee, beaded specs sitting leg crossed along her lap, she speaks of beaches deeper than your dreams, crystal waters that caressed your skin like necklaces, soft waves that wove seashells and stones into a secret magic. The children at her feet close their eyes to feel that rushing sea on their faces, resurrecting the smiles of those old shorelines. She speaks of band concerts in every backyard, melodies built on butterflies and birdsong, and boating frogs dancing in dew-filled blades.
Like I said, that was just an excerpt of one of the poems from Anika Christopher. And yeah, you can get a lot more from the preview itself. Feel free to download it. I think we have the QR code, Bianca. If not, it's fine. You can just go to our website. You'll find it there. And I encourage you all to continue supporting the work. And those of us in civil society, I look forward to our continued collaboration and with the support of folks like Climate Analytics Caribbean. Thank you so much.
Congratulations to you and the folks at Proper Foundation, Adin, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the foreword is written by the UNFCCC Executive Secretary,
Oh my
Mrs. Emma
goodness,
Steele.
how did I forget
Forgot the most important part.
Well, definitely a selling point. Our very own Grenadian Simon Steele, who functions as the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. I mean, I did mention that we have people running the show. We literally have one running the show, and we did manage, with the help of Rwanda, we did manage to get him to pen the foreword to the anthology, and for that we are very enormously thankful.
Yeah, when I saw that, I was like, how did Adin get the time,
Rwanda.
His day? Rwanda, okay, that would explain it. But yes, congratulations again, and thank you very much. So we want to head straight, the only people now keeping you in between wine is yourself, because we're going to go into the questions and answers now. I do want to field a couple from our virtual platforms, and our first question, while we await from our audience, Sasha, we have a question from Camille, who's in Australia, and she says, as a PhD candidate working in the climate science justice interface, I'm curious what evidence is really needed by SIDS concerning climate impacts to advance the agenda for loss and damage. Do we really need individual studies to highlight the impacts occurring because of climate change, or is there something else scientists should be working on, or people scientists should be working on to improve the use of research to those that need it most?
Sure. So I think that's a very valid question. And when I was developing the Island Advancement Project that's being funded by the Open Societies Foundation, which is our flagship loss and damage project by Climate Analytics Caribbean, that was actually a question. How are Caribbean countries reporting or documenting or assessing loss and damage in the region? Where are the studies? Where is the evidence? What is happening? So earlier this year in June, we launched a review of loss and damage in the Caribbean, 1994 to to 2024, so 30 years, and it's a desktop review. And one of the key questions, is how are we reporting on loss and damage? How are we defining loss and damage in the region? What are the tools, methodologies, assessments that we're using to assess and report on loss and damage? And this was, what we found was that there was no comprehensive systematic report or study done. This was the first. And one of the key findings of that report was that every country was reporting on loss and damage differently, because if you notice, there is no official definition of loss and damage, which is a problem. And another key finding was that a lot of the loss and damage we were reporting on tended to focus on hurricanes and flooding, right? And that really was on economic loss and damage. But we were excluding other other slow onset events like sea level rise, right? Which is a major issue in the Caribbean, but we were not reporting on that. And then the methodologies we used were largely the damage and loss assessment, which was developed by UN ECLAC, as well as the post-disaster needs assessment developed by the World Bank. But it's interesting to note that these two assessments, they don't actually use that, typology or that framing of loss and damage under the UNFCCC. So even the tools or the methodologies we're using to report on loss and damage aren't actually measuring what we broadly consider loss and damage under the UNFCCC. So one of the key recommendations coming out of the report is the need for the Caribbean to develop a common methodology or approach to how we assess and report on loss and damage. And that one of the things is, how do we define loss and damage? And this is quite important because this is where we could now position ourselves to start estimating what our loss and damage finance needs are. And this could be participatory because it could take into account, the lived experiences of communities and people who are dealing with loss and damage. And it's coming from us rather than we looking towards universities or institutes in the global north. And once we have that, we're positioning ourselves now to be able to access the loss and damage fund and other types of climate finance as well. So I think that was a key outcome coming out of that report, those findings. And it really looks at the fact that even though we have a lot of research and studies happening, it needs to be more coordinated, and we definitely need to have this more common approach to how we assess and report on loss and damage for the region. So we're hoping we get more funding for phase 2 to see how we could lead that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. I always have to have a little bit of a giggle when people say that we don't have an official definition for loss and damage, because here we are, we have an entire fund operationalized, we have an entire committee discussing this. It's a topic COP after COP after COP, but it doesn't have an official definition. Hilarious. Colin, I have a question for you, and this one is from Raphael Heffron from France, who asks, how has the Just Transition Pathway Work Program been updated after COP29?
I spoke to that earlier in terms of the update. So just a little more context, there was a draft decision that I would say was the consensus of the parties up to that point, in terms of we had gone through the process of negotiations, had gone through the process of giving interventions about the priorities of each country or each party, within the room. And it was a matter of refining and getting parties to see their priorities reflected in the text. This wasn't the case. So, but as I said, the next steps would include, I would say the positive thing is that most parties agree that adaptation is a topic of discussion and something that needs prioritizing in the Just Transition Work Program discussions. So the update we can safely say is that that topic next year should be one of the topics in the workshop. But we have to make that submission as parties to have that recorded, and then the UNFCCC Secretariat will decide the details of that topic. And Ardeen and Sasha, we also pointed to the role of civil society. So an update could be that, is that the involvement of civil society is very much, the door is open for civil society to be involved in that submission process, because if you go on the portal, you see everyone submits, just not only parties and countries, but you have institutes, NGOs, private persons. Anyone has the opportunity to submit what they think this work program should look like and the outcomes of this work program.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Colin. So do we have any questions from the audience? Sure.
Just 2 comments. Thanks everybody for your presentation. Ardeen in particular, I want to respond.
Do we have a, okay.
Thanks everybody for their presentations. Ardeen in particular, I want to respond to you in that both myself and Akila Jaramogi was at Dubai last year, and Akila, of course, would be Akila in saying that, of course, the space is not welcoming for civil society. But I also want to plug Cropper Foundation for the 2 climate courses that you're doing. And I think the second one in particular could assist young people in getting to where you wanted to talk about, because I particularly appreciate the policy piece that the course has. So I think you all are in the right direction. And just to say that in terms of our NAPs and our NDCs, it's unfortunate that our both documents, unfortunately, are gender blind, and we're hoping that moving forward they will change. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have a question at the back. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you very much for that presentation, for your just this camaraderie of people who are like-minded. Like somebody said to me that you eat, dream, sleep climate change, and I said, perhaps I do. I'm Marcia Tinto from the Environmental Management Authority and National ACE Focal Point. I have different perspectives at Baku. First of all, let me talk about the positive things, because with respect to negotiations for ACE, we were quite successful. What did not happen in Dubai last year or in Sharm el-Sheikh before actually happened this year, where with respect to negotiations, we were actually able to reinforce in the text the importance of finance and tools and support for ACE. Now, I want to talk a little bit about ACE, and please stop me if I'm going on too much, because when I start talking, sometimes I just don't know when to stop. I deal with a lot of these soft issues, the issues that put on
Marcia, we just wanted to get what ACE is for the benefit of everyone.
That's what I was going to do.
Perfect,
yes.
Thank you.
So ACE is Action for Climate Empowerment. It's a follow-through on Article 6 under the Convention, and this was enabled at COP29 under the Glasgow Work Programme for Climate Empowerment, Action for Climate Empowerment. And there are 6 pillars of ACE. I mean, there's quite a bit, but education, public awareness, public access to information, public participation, training, international cooperation, all those things are the things that we do we're doing all that right now. Public access to information, participation. So ACE is cross-cutting, but you hear the jargon. Yes, ACE is cross-cutting, but people do not really, and I'm speaking generally here, perhaps not people in this room, but I find very often trying to deal with the technocrats to convince them that ACE is not just, or those educators, those are the people who deal with ACE, and not realizing that it is something that ACE is part of all the work that we do. So that was successful, but I wanted to talk about 2 other things. Bringing youth in now, because that is definitely part of the discussion. Some of our panelists spoke about youth, but I had attended quite a few of those meetings as well, and gender, which I'll give a little bit on, but as I said, not too much. One of the priorities of the Secretariat, or a call I would rather say, is for youth perspectives and concerns into NDC 3.0. Now, that is a challenge because, not that youth don't have perspectives. I mean, I work with youth all the time on engagement and empowerment. But how do we get that into our NDCs? How do we get the perspectives of youth? How do we get, to have people really take youth seriously? Because again, it's a word, we have to get the youth involved, they're the future, and, you hear all of that. But and I'm speaking, maybe I'm being a little bit too emotional here because sometimes I get really frustrated with it, where there's always a talk about youth, but when it's time to engage, the youth are not on the platform with other people. You have your youth groups and you have your youth forum, or fora rather, but not on the negotiating platform. So this is something we have to think about. With respect to gender, that's another issue. The gender negotiations were not particularly fruitful. You had countries who were trying to shift the discussions. So, for example, changing from gender responsive narratives, which were already agreed on, to more gender sensitive gender perspectives. And then even within G77 plus China, just to give a little bit about that, they're no longer 77. This was in 1964. This was formed with 77 developing countries plus China, who are not, well, they're not a member. They give support, finance, but we have about 138 of those countries now, 134. But in those countries, my point in saying all this, within the G77 group, they are developing countries, but they're actually countries that are developed in that group. So there will always be, I don't want to say disagreement, but disagreement in opinions, because, and I don't want to call any parties names because I have to be politically correct, no pun intended, but you do have developed countries in the G77, and there is always, pulling and tugging when it comes to discussions and decisions. So again, this is something that I think we need to be cognizant about. But I'm getting back to the last point that I made, because I think I need not advice, but feedback as to how, because it's not how, we must include the youth concerns and perspectives into this upcoming NDC report, which is due next year. So I'd like to hear what others would have to say about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ruana, you probably want to... Okay, we're going to take another question and then...
Somebody I talk of, listen to speak about ants that spin in a circle and don't know how to get out of this cycle of the circle because the report is doing nothing. Sorry for the thing. The report. All right, we have an ICC report about Israel. Just this, the evidence of something that is extractive, is continuous. And I'm glad that you all are doing what you'll do. How are you working on your frustration? That is my concern. How are you working on your disappointment, your despair? Because you don't need no evidence. Ikakas had a lamppost outside in the water. And it's gone. Right? Evidence to prove to who? To white people? Who greedy and taking? So how are you working on your disappointment, your despair? This will kill you. That's all.
Thanks, Robert. Ruana, you want to take a stab?
With the quickness, all right. Maybe I'll start back to front. So maybe I'll start with Robert. Robert, thanks for that. The frustration and the despair is there and it's palpable. Where are my tears? Not here tonight. Not here tonight, but I can assure you I have cried very many. Very many. I have been in this process for long enough to have shed many, many tears over the lack of progress, over the disrespect, over the callousness, over the feeling of powerlessness when you speak and you feel as though no one cares and no one is listening. Many a tear has been shed by myself and many others. This process is one that demands much from the human spirit in terms of dedication, in terms of sacrifice. And so I assure you that the frustration is there. How we work on it? Well, personally, I have a therapist. And when it's carnival time, I hit the streets very hard. That's a part of my salvation. But, you know, I like to think that solutions start at home. And so the evidence that you talk about, that is very clear for us to see, it is being documented, yes, for the sake of, you know, the Eurocentric scientific method, which prevails in terms of how we understand this crisis. But sometimes I wonder whether we actually understand the evidence. Those of us who feel it and who know it, whether we look at the lampposts that out in the sea, or if you're in Belize or Grenada, the grave sites on the coast that have now drifted into the ocean, you know, whether we look at this and understand what is happening and understand what is required and understand that the solutions start with us. Because yes, we are not responsible for the crisis. We definitely did not cause it. Yes, those who are responsible for the crisis do have to shoulder that responsibility. And for the past 30 years, we've seen a lot of shucking and jiving, trying to wind below the line, away from that responsibility. And there are those who are emerging as just as responsible as those who would have gone through the Industrial Revolution in the early 1900s, right? Those who are emerging, who are saying, as Marcy put it, Marcia said, you know, we negotiate as a group of developing countries, but some of us in that group are much more developed than others. Yes.
Is that there will be no foreign exchange if oil is not sold.
Well.
Unless you do things like what I'm doing.
Well.
Trying to sell clothes. And also, we have to import because we don't make the fabric here. So it's a spin, but this is not this discussion. This is your report, so I go on.
No. It's not spin. No, I'm glad you put the question on the table because, you know, all of this is wrapped up in the just transition discussion that Carlon was speaking about. It's a question of not just because what we have agreed, every country, petrostate or not, what we have agreed in the Paris Agreement is that we will all eventually transition. That is the bottom line of what was agreed in 2015. We agreed that we have to limit the increase in average global temperatures to within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I know that when we start to call those numbers, you know, people start to fade away. What is this? But what that means in real terms is that we have to halve global emissions by 2030. We have 5 years to halve those emissions. We know what is causing those emissions. It means a transition, a decarbonization, especially of those who have had the opportunity to take advantage of those resources for the longest time. And a part of what we cannot find ourselves out of, as you said, ants running in a circle, is this question of what does that transition mean in terms of who goes first, in terms of where the money goes to help countries to be able to transition, in terms of who is bearing the cost and the burden. So when we talk about we will have no forex, we have not actually diversified our economy except to look to downstream industries from ever since. And we're still speaking about that now as a means of diversification, which it is not. What does it mean that we have committed to this goal, especially since the lamppost that was in the carcass is now in the sea? So it's not a question of, it's not black and white, especially not for countries in a position like us. We feel it, we know it, but we have also participated in the problem. We didn't cause it. So this is why these global conversations are important, because that is where the answer is going to be found. As not fit for purpose as it might be at this point in time, that is where the discussion is taking place. Who goes first? Who pays? Who gets to go last? Who gets to drill the last barrel? When does the last barrel happen? Those are the issues that are on the table. So, yes, I wanted to go to Marcy on the issue of the nationally determined contributions and the question of youth. I think we have to also think about what these nationally determined contributions are, what this report is, as Robert put it, why these reports matter, right? So the intention behind that document was to have countries submit internationally their plan to address the climate crisis through their mitigation action in the first instance and provide some transparency on how they are decarbonizing the major emitting sectors in their country. Countries have also said it is important to include adaptation in that context. Some countries have referenced the need to include loss and damage. But the NDC itself is more of a target document. So the question of how we include the youth, how we include gender in these types of documents has to come into how we conceive of these targets. How are these targets set? What is the national conversation around setting these targets? And the same goes to, for the first question around the national adaptation plans and the fact that they're gender blind. At this point, apparently, how do we conceive of these targets and who they affect? It comes down to who they affect. And this, it all goes back to empowerment and climate action. It all goes back to education, because we, as a people in the region, not just here, have not been engaging our policymakers in real tangible terms around how these targets are being set and what provision is being made for the people that they will affect. And that is the thing that needs to change. So maybe I'll stop there and give it back to you, Ryan.
Thanks very much, Rana. We have a question right there.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I want to thank the panel for your contributions. My name is Marie Scott. I'm a consultant. I work in the climate change space. And I have just a couple of quick questions and observations. The journalist, the communication specialist on the panel mentioned diplomacy. Somebody actually said new administration in the US. Right? So Trump is coming in. I'll call his name. He's coming in, and Ruana spoke about bobbing and weaving. I mean, how do you feel going forward to Belém? I mean, thank God Bolsonaro is no longer the president there, because that would have also been a challenging issue. How confident there will be, a heightened bobbing and weaving in countries looking to the US and they not meeting their commitments and they backpedaling in some of the commitments they have made and feel they would have gotten a break for 4 years? That's my first question. The other one is, how beneficial do you think it is to have COP every single year? I know there are preparatory meetings in between, where you work out some of the technical aspects. But is there a need for a COP meeting every single year? And the other thing, Sasha spoke to loss and damage, and there not being agreement on the term. And I think that is not as important as us having a sense of really what it means. Even pictures are a source of real. We're talking about the lamppost that used to be there and now is in the sea. You know, that is evidence of loss. And if we in the Caribbean think about creating a framework for what defines loss and damage, our lenders, the ones who are going to say we're going to give you debt relief or stop debt payments because of loss and damage, they will define what loss or damage is for you. World Bank, IMF, which they currently do. So I don't know how practical, I can tell you as a researcher, whoever pays the piper calls the tune. So I can give you a really valid example that happened to me with doing work for the United Nations. I remember writing the orange economy in a report and giving recommendations. Say, orange economy is a term used by the IDB. We do not use that term in the UN. We talk about the creative industries. It means the same thing. When you look at the overlapping words and what industries are included, it means exactly the same thing. So I don't think it is as important. That's just my opinion, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on those three things. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, let's go with Sasha. First, Sasha, can you tell us a little bit about the last question?
So thanks for that. And when I said that we needed a common methodology, it's how we assess and report on loss and damage, and through that we will have some sort of common understanding or definition. Maybe we might have a definition for what loss and damage means for the Caribbean, because right now, it as you clearly, rightly said, it's based on who pays. And we need to position ourselves, because this is happening to us right now. So, I mean, I remember at COP, and we had our side event on the 18th, and the Sunday, my house was flooded out, and my entire street was flooded. And it was probably one of the worst flooding that we've ever experienced in Couva. That happened there, and you're seeing this, and then you have to go into COP and go and negotiate and so on. But that sort of flooding is something that we know is loss and damage, or climate impacts that could lead to loss and damage in rural, low-lying communities in Trinidad. But it might mean something else in another country in the Caribbean. So we need to have a better understanding of how we go around about defining or understanding what loss and damage means for the Caribbean. So having this, it will be a discussion, a dialogue to define what this sort of common approach will be. Not methodology, maybe approach, something broader, because we need to start looking at that first. And interestingly, there is no definition for climate finance either. We're still, we still have negotiations on it. So regardless of whether you have a definition or not, the negotiations happen because we have an understanding of what this term entails. Yeah. Thank you.
Colin, I'm just going to throw the greenwashing question to you and the level of greenwashing we can expect. And it's not just what's happening in the United States, but the number of right-wing governments we're seeing being elected across Europe and different parts of the world.
All right, thanks for that left field. Again, no, I think history would show that when President Trump was elected the first time, there were talks about the exit of the United States out of the Paris Agreement. We are unaware of what is going to come. However, you would have seen that they did not exit eventually. So in this instance, what we can safely say is that diplomacy has its part to play, and hopefully we can only hope that parties like the United States and their negotiators continue to progress the work of the UNFCCC and the negotiations and COP in a way that doesn't really stop or prevent progress generally. So whether or not they have stances as a party or as a country, that should not impact, because history would show that it did not impact significantly what the media or, sorry Ryan, portrayed that sort of election or coming into office would have brought. So we could only hope for that sort of similar trend, because it's actually hard to get out of the Paris Agreement. It's not as easy as it's just like, oh, we're not in the Paris Agreement anymore. It takes a process. So, 2 turns.
On the topic of whether COP, is relevant every year, Ruana, I do want to broaden that a little bit, because it's a concern not only raised in this room, but at the midway point of COP29, the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, as well as the former UNFCCC Executive Secretary Christiana Figueres, as well as Rockstrom, who's this very famous climate scientist, they penned a letter, they sent it to the United Nations saying that the COP29 process wasn't, quote, fit for purpose. So I kind of want you to speak to both of them, whether it's really relevant every year, but also if the process itself needs sort of re-engineering.
Yeah, the process itself, I would say at this point, because of where we are in the discussion, the rubber needs to hit the road, and that is exposing a lot of the fragility around the process. But this type of fragility is not specific to the climate discussion. It is one that is inherent throughout any multilateral conversation, because at the end of the day, the major subjects of international law are states. And in order for them to be subjected to any international rule or norm, they have to consent to be subjected to that rule or norm. So Robert raised the issue of the ICJ, I think, advised your opinion on Israel in relation to the Israel-Palestine issue, which, even though it has a major persuasive impact, has largely gone ignored in terms of the recommendations that were made. And this is the highest international court in the world, and this is a court. It's not a policy-making forum. They make laws. And so we see that when we talk about the actions of states and whether or not a state can actually be held to take a particular action, the international process cannot do it, right? And that's because of the nature of the process itself. So this is not something specific to the climate question. But what is happening now within the climate space, because that space is one where we make decisions by consensus and not voting, so there is no voting, the rules on voting were never adopted, that has often been held up as an example of a means through which the process isn't working, right? It's held up as an example of one of the ways in which the process is no longer fit for purpose, because one country can block. And this has happened in the past with varying results. It's not always the case that one country can block a consensus. Consensus does not mean unanimity. But this is inherent in the multilateral process. If, for example, we have a process where decisions are made by majority. So, for example, in the UN General Assembly in New York, resolutions are passed. There is allowance for a voting process. What we see happens in that setting is that those decisions can be undermined by the fact that there was a vote. And decisions that are passed by vote, where a significant number of parties are not in support, even though it might get over the line, there is absolutely no momentum around implementation of those resolutions. None. So they're on the books, more or less for the sake of being on the books, because they do not actually have consensus. They have not attracted consensus. So when it comes to where the money goes, it's not going to go towards implementing a decision where a significant number of parties did not agree. And so that is why there is power in a process that allows for decision making by consensus. But it is fragile. And that is what we're seeing now. So there are lots of conversations around, do we need another instrument? So there's a whole discussion now happening around a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So in the same way that we have nuclear non-proliferation treaties, so there's a discussion happening on whether we need a treaty that's specifically going to set schedules for phasing out fossil fuels, since we've been so unsuccessful in having that conversation under the UNFCCC. We don't know what the fate of that discussion will be. On the question of whether we need a COP every year, this is one that is constantly being debated. Do we need to drag ourselves to one side of the world or the other with all of the emissions that come with that and with all of the expenditure that comes with that in order to do this on an annual basis? What I will say is that in 2020, we didn't have a COP because of COVID, right? And the process evolved so that we were still discussing things, but virtually. We were trying to make decisions virtually. It did not work. It does not work. Because whereas if you are at a COP and you're meeting in person and somebody is, you cannot understand their point of view, you think that you would like to have a conversation with them one-on-one to try to see where they're coming from, to try to build common ground.
There's really much more engagement with civil society, with persons, really to understand what this just transition process would look like and how they will be impacted, and also underscoring some of the benefits of a transition. We have to look at what can be seen as new developments, and not even new, but things that we've been doing as indigenous practices or things that innate to us as Trinidadians, Tobagonians, Caribbean persons that could actually make this transition even better than we can expect. So it's not to have this doom and gloom about moving from oil and gas, but to understand that there are other things on the horizon. Thank you.
Ruana, you don't get away. Your New Year's wish.
My New Year's wish. There are a number of elections coming up next year throughout the region, not just here. My New Year's wish, what I would like to see is climate change become a real issue for those elections. I would like to see the energy and excitement and creativity that the youth have expressed around the climate crisis, like fuel into the discussions that have to happen on the road to all of these elections that are happening next year.
Thank you very much, Ruana, Shayleaf, Carlin, Ardeen, Sasha, and thank you very much. And on behalf of everyone at Climate Analytics Caribbean, Bianca in the background, Risa's always, I think I saw her somewhere. Oh, there she is. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everybody.